Hello, everyone. Tonight we're going to dim the lights and unravel a story that starts with the clink of crystal glasses, a roast chicken I seasoned myself, and one sentence that changed everything. You might think betrayal happens with a bang, a dramatic fight, a slammed door, a tearful confession. But sometimes it sounds more like laughter around a dinner table. Quiet, polite, deadly. So before you feel like you're the only one who's ever stood in a room full of people and felt invisible, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to know your story too. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. I was standing in the kitchen that night, still wearing the same sweater I'd thrown on that morning to run errands. I had spent hours prepping the food, olive tapenade, lemon garlic potatoes, and a roast chicken that had been marinating since sunrise. The table was set with the good linens, candles flickering, jazz playing softly from the Bluetooth speaker I paid for. Always the right ambiance. The guests, my son Drew, his girlfriend Kelsey, and her parents again. I wasn't officially invited, but I knew better than to leave the house looking like no one lived there. Kelsey had forgotten to mention the dinner again, so there I was, pretending not to exist in the home I bought. I was carrying up a bottle of wine from the basement, one of the good ones I'd been saving for a holiday, when I heard it. Kelsey's mom voice, dripping with mock curiosity, asked, "And you are—" Kelsey laughed before Drew could even open his mouth. "Oh, that's Linda, our unofficial maid, keeps the place running." Everyone laughed. Even my son, even Drew. I stood frozen for a moment, holding that bottle of Merlot like it might shatter in my hand. I smiled the way women do when they've just been gutted but still want to be polite. Then I walked over to the kitchen counter, set down the wine, and left the room. The laughter floated behind me like smoke I couldn't wave away. That's the thing about moments like these. You don't yell, you don't break things, you just disappear. Silently, quietly, like someone fading out of a picture. I sat on the edge of my bed that night, staring at the door I had painted a warm sage green years ago, back when Drew was still in college, and I believed in fresh starts. My hands rested on my lap palms, open like I was still hoping someone would place something kind into them. Instead, they'd handed me humiliation, a little old-age fact I used to roll my eyes at. As we get older, our skin gets thinner, literally, but I swear so does our patience for being treated like wallpaper. I thought of everything I'd given them, my retirement, my energy, my name on the mortgage. I remembered the time I paid Drew's tuition, using the last of the money my dad left me when he died. I remembered when I moved into the basement so they could have the master suite. And now I was the maid. Here's a quirky little fact for you. The word maid comes from maiden, which originally meant an unmarried woman. Interesting how over time it turned into someone who's just expected to serve. That night I didn't cry. I just lay back on the bed, shoes still on, and stared at the ceiling until morning. Sometimes in academic debate there's this term, epistemic rupture. It's when a new piece of knowledge fractures the entire framework of how you understand your world. That was me. That moment. I couldn't unhear it. The next morning, I woke up at 6:30 like I always did, made coffee, fed Kelsey's cat, which she pretended to like more than she actually did. The sun streamed in through the kitchen blinds like nothing had changed. But everything had. I heard Kelsey coming down the stairs, phone in one hand, yoga mat in the other, already mid-conversation with someone about soul alignment and vibrational clarity. I waited until she paused to take a breath. Then I held out the keys. All of them. Front door, back, garage, mailbox. She blinked. "What's this?" I smiled. "Good luck paying the mortgage now." And then I walked down the hallway past the photos I framed, the rug I hand-washed every spring, the walls I painted in colors they never noticed. I didn't take anything, not even the knit throw I loved from the reading chair, just my purse. And the wool coat I was wearing the day I brought Drew home from the hospital. Drew called my name as I opened the front door. I didn't stop. He followed me out, barefoot panic, finally cracking through whatever spell Kelsey had him under. But I didn't turn around. I didn't slam the car door. I closed it gently. Because when something inside you finally breaks, it doesn't always explode. Sometimes it just settles. Clarity is quiet. It doesn't yell. It doesn't plead. It just knows. And I knew I was done. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew where I wasn't staying. And that was enough for now. The apartment smelled like mildew and mothballs when I first stepped inside. My great-aunt Ida had left it to me in her will, a little second-floor walk-up over a defunct laundromat. The wallpaper was yellowed with age, and the radiator let out a death rattle every 10 minutes. But the key turned the door opened, and the silence. Well, it was mine. I dropped my purse on the chipped kitchen counter and stood still, letting the weight of everything I wasn't carrying anymore settle into the old linoleum floor. The walls were bare, except for a single hook where a clock must have hung decades ago. The kitchen table was round and wobbly. The only chair creaked when I sat. No one had followed me here. No phone call, no apology. Drew, who I once taught to ride a bike on the sidewalk of our old neighborhood, had said nothing since I walked out the door. I made myself a cup of tea using a kettle that looked like it came from a museum. There was no microwave, no Wi-Fi, just a space that didn't ask anything of me. And for the first time in years, I could hear my own thoughts. That night, I slept on the old pull-out couch with springs that poked through like little reminders that comfort wasn't earned in a day. I wrapped myself in the only blanket I could find and stared at the ceiling, which had a water stain shaped suspiciously like Florida. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just breathed. You ever hear the saying, "A woman is like a tea bag. You never know how strong she is until she's in hot water"? I used to think that was cute. Now it just felt accurate. And a little ironic, considering I was drinking tea that tasted like dust and regrets. In the morning, I opened the windows and let the cold November air slap some sense into me. I dusted the counters, wiped down the windowsills, and swept the floor. Moving helped. It always had. And then, while looking for a screwdriver in the hallway closet, because the coat hook had come loose, of course, I stumbled on it. A trunk. It was tucked behind a pile of crocheted Afghans and brittle Sears catalogues. Heavy. Metal. Rusted at the corners. I remembered it vaguely from when I used to visit Aunt Ida as a kid. It always sat under her sewing machine like a footrest no one questioned. I pried it open using a butter knife and a little righteous frustration. Expected fabric. Buttons. Old recipe cards, maybe. But what I found instead was my entire world flipped inside out. Inside were envelopes. Dozens. Tied in twine, yellowed with time, labelled in my aunt's careful script. One in particular had my name on it. "Linda, in case you ever come back. I'm sorry." I sat right there on the floor and opened it. Inside were copies of hospital documents, a birth certificate, and a letter. As I read, my hands began to tremble. Turns out Aunt Ida had been a nurse back in the 80s. She was working the night Drew was born, only he wasn't Drew then. Not yet. There had been confusion, a last-minute room change, an issue with the ID tags. She noticed the mix-up but was dismissed by the shift lead. And by the time she raised the concern again, it was too late. Babies had already gone home. But years later, while cleaning out her files, she found documents from the hospital's legal department. A quiet settlement. A DNA test with a last name she didn't recognize. Bennett. James Bennett. A boy born the same night in the same hospital under suspiciously similar circumstances. According to the letter, the baby I had brought home wasn't mine. And the one who was had grown up just 15 miles away. I reread that line 5 times, my vision swimming. The couch groaned behind me. Outside, a bus wheezed past like the world was still turning normally, like this wasn't the moment that shattered my understanding of my own life. I wanted to vomit or laugh. Instead, I sat back and stared at my reflection in the dusty microwave door. And for a second, just a second, I wondered if this explained everything. The coldness, the distance, the way Drew never quite looked at me like I belonged in his life. Maybe I didn't. I once read an academic essay that said the concept of motherhood is both biological and performative. That to mother is not only to give birth, but to continuously act the part. I had done the acting, the loving, the giving. But now I had to ask who had I done it for? And more importantly, who had I lost in the process? That night I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I just sat with the documents spread across the old trunk, letting the truth sit in my chest like a second heartbeat. A quirky fact that popped into my brain at the worst possible time: sloths only go to the bathroom once a week. Maybe that's nature's way of saying some things are just too heavy to let go of easily. This was one of those things. I didn't call Drew. I didn't scream at the hospital or hire a private detective. I just folded everything back into the envelope and slid it into the drawer next to my bed. Then I poured myself another cup of terrible tea and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. There was a bookstore on Main Street, small, green, tucked between a florist and a bike shop. The documents said James Bennett, my real son, owned it. I'd passed by it a dozen times over the years, and I had never gone inside. But now, maybe I would. The first time I saw James Bennett in person, I nearly tripped over a sidewalk planter. He was standing behind the front counter of the bookstore, adjusting a stack of hardcovers with practiced ease. Tall, neatly dressed in a dark green sweater and jeans, he looked normal. Like a man who owned more than one pair of reading glasses and preferred slow jazz to sports radio. He had kind eyes, the kind that don't dodge yours when you speak, and hair that fell just slightly out of place, like he'd been running his hands through it between customers. I stood across the street pretending to drink from a paper cup of lukewarm coffee and just watched. This was the son I never knew. The son who had grown up in a different neighborhood, gone to a different school, called another woman Mom. And yet, something in the slope of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, when he smiled at a customer, it felt familiar, like a song I'd heard once a long time ago. Of course I didn't go in, that day or the next. Instead, I began a ritual. I'd sit on the bench just outside the bakery 2 doors down and watch. Sometimes I'd bring a notebook and pretend to write. Other times, I'd just sit there with my coffee and let the weight of this accidental life press into my spine. That first week, he restocked the poetry shelf, helped an older man carry a stack of history books to his car, and laughed with a woman about her dog eating a signed copy of something. All simple things. But they stitched a picture together in my head. James was gentle, warm, present. Not Drew. Not the boy who had sat across from me at dinner tables for 2 decades and never once asked if I was happy. There's a saying I read once. If you watch something long enough, it reveals itself. And that's what happened with James. Every day I came back, I saw a little more. His schedule, his rhythm, the customers who greeted him like an old friend, the way he locked up at exactly 7:03 each night, and always held the door for anyone still browsing. And slowly, without meaning to, I began to learn his life like it was a story I was trying to finish. Meanwhile, my old life, the one I had walked away from, was still flickering like a broken neon sign in the background. Drew sent a text, just one. "You okay?" "No, Mom. No apology." Just that. I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I couldn't go back to being someone whose worth was only measured in utility. I wasn't a dishwasher. I wasn't a babysitter. I wasn't a background character. I was a woman who had given too much for too long and was finally learning to give something to herself. And here's a weird but true scientific fact I ran across. While Googling insomnia cures octopuses have 3 hearts, but when they swim, 2 of them stop beating. Which means every time they move forward, they're also breaking part of themselves. I thought about that every night, because I was moving forward, and it hurt. Back in the apartment, I started writing in my old spiral-bound notebooks again. At first, it was just scribbles, observations, sentences like, "His voice is low but kind. He always smiles with his eyes before his mouth. I wonder if he likes the smell of old books, or if he's just used to it." But then the entries shifted. I began writing things I'd never said out loud, confessions to myself. I used to hope Drew would say thank you for dinner. I cried in the car once when they went to a vacation without telling me. I think I miss the idea of being needed more than I miss the people who needed me. Somewhere between day 10 and 11 of my bookstore stakeout, something shifted. James came outside during a lull and sat on the bench. My bench. I panicked, looked away, then realized he was just scrolling through his phone, sipping something that looked suspiciously like peppermint tea. He glanced up, gave a small, polite smile. I nodded. That was all. But my heart pounded like a marching band had started playing in my ribcage. I went home that day and couldn't stop pacing. How do you tell someone that their whole life started with a mistake? How do you say, "Hey, you've never met me, but I'm your biological mother"? Surprise. That's when I found it, tucked into the bottom of the trunk under the folded hospital forms, and Ruth's confession letter was a photo, a newborn, swaddled, his hospital tag barely visible. James. I held that photo like it was made of glass. His eyes were shut mouth in a little O like he was about to yawn. He didn't look like Drew, but he did look like me. There was no use pretending anymore. This wasn't just paperwork. This was blood and bone and time. A life that had grown up just beyond my reach. One night, I dreamed we were baking cookies, James and I, flour on our hands, an old recipe book between us. And when I woke up, I cried, not the broken kind of cry, but the soft one. The kind you get when you remember something sweet that was never real. That morning, I made a decision. I was going inside the bookstore, just once, to see if the way he treated strangers was real, to see if the boy I didn't get to raise might recognize something in me too. The bell above the bookstore door gave a soft jingle when I stepped inside. It sounded like the kind of sound you'd expect in a holiday movie, charming, faintly nostalgic, and entirely non-threatening. My hands were clammy. I had rehearsed a dozen lines in my head, each more awkward than the last. But when I walked in, I said nothing, just browsed. The air smelled like cedar shelves and worn paper soothing familiar like old memories that hadn't gone sour yet. A soft, instrumental soundtrack played overhead, something piano-heavy and melancholy. James stood behind the register, his head bowed slightly as he scribbled something into a ledger. He looked up when he heard the bell. "Hi there," he said, with a polite smile. "Let me know if you need anything." I nodded, voice caught in my throat. I drifted through the shelves, trailing a fingertip along spines of novels I'd either read decades ago or always meant to. One copy caught my eye, a first edition print of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. The kind of book that didn't belong to any genre, but made you feel wiser just by holding it. "Good choice," he said, suddenly appearing beside me like a librarian ghost. Hard to find these days. I smiled without showing teeth. "I've been looking for something like this." "Well, I'm glad you found it." His voice was low, calming. Not too chipper. No hint of salesmanship. He rang me up without fanfare, slipped the book into a brown paper bag, with the store's name hand-stamped on the front, Bennett & Co. That stung a little, I won't lie. He handed me the bag, and when our fingers brushed, something strange passed through me. Not recognition, not electricity, just warmth. Like my body had been waiting to exhale and didn't know it until that moment. "You own this place?" I asked, feigning casual interest. He nodded. Sort of. My parents helped me get started a few years ago. They're retired now, so I keep things running. Of course they helped. Of course he had support. It wasn't bitter, not exactly. Just this quiet throb of injustice. Drew had nothing when I raised him, no savings, no job. And I gave everything my time, my energy, my stability. And yet James, he had the kind of calm that could only come from a life where people showed up for you. But the world isn't fair. We know this. I walked out with the book and a heart that felt like it had been gently rearranged. Back in the apartment, I set the bag down on the kitchen table and stared at it. The book inside was a keepsake, now a timestamp, a reminder that I'd finally stepped into the world of my real son. A few days later, I returned. This time, I pretended I needed a gift for a neighbor, then again for a friend recovering from surgery, and then, just because I was in the area, each time we spoke a little more about books, about weather, about the lack of decent bagels in town. Nothing personal, nothing deep. But still, it added up. He started to recognize me. Back again, he'd say with a grin. "You keep stocking good stuff," I'd reply. He never pressed, never asked my name. Maybe he thought I was lonely. Maybe I looked the part. Once, while we chatted about an old collection of Rainer Maria Rilke poems, he said, "You remind me of someone. Can't quite put my finger on it." I laughed. "Hopefully someone you liked." He smiled. "Yeah, someone I respected." That moment stayed with me for days. Meanwhile, the wreckage of my old life was still smouldering in the background. I'd done a little more digging into Drew and Kelsey's situation, and let's just say things weren't quite as curated as their Instagram made it seem. Kelsey's business, some faux spiritual coaching platform called Rise with Kelsey, was mostly air and glitter. I looked up the LLC, found some bad reviews, checked property filings. Drew had no job. The house still in my name was the only thing keeping them from collapsing. And here's your odd little wisdom fact for this section. Cockroaches can live for a week without their heads. Sounds awful, right? But somehow fitting. Because that's what Drew and Kelsey were, a headless household, still twitching on inertia and denial. I wasn't going to intervene, not yet, but I started writing again, this time in a second notebook. Not poetry, not venting, strategy. Dates, names, business licenses, social media activity, payments made, payments missed. Not because I was planning revenge, but because clarity demands receipts. And every time James recommended a new book, or remembered that I liked lemon tea, I wrote that down too. Because I was finally learning who he was, and more importantly, who I was, when I wasn't constantly trying to survive someone else's storm. There's a term in academic psychology, parentification. It describes when a child becomes the caregiver to their own parents, emotionally or practically. I'd lived a reverse version of that. I had mothered Drew so hard I forgot to mother myself. But James, he didn't know me. Not really. And still, in 5-minute conversations about chapter endings and cover art, he made me feel like a person again. I still hadn't told him the truth. But I was getting closer. And the day I did, I wanted to be ready, not just for his reaction, but for mine. I was walking the same route every day by now. Past the bakery across from the bookstore, coffee in hand, black no sugar, just to have something to hold. I wasn't spying. I wasn't lurking. I was studying. By this point, I had James's rhythm memorized. Mondays were quiet. He reordered inventory and refilled the cafe sugar jars himself. Tuesdays, Mrs. Diller, an older woman who always wore a shawl and smelled like lilacs, came in for book club picks. Thursdays, school kids wandered in for comics. Fridays, his friend Kyle dropped by with 2 sandwiches and a noisy laugh that echoed through the whole store. And Saturdays, he hummed, softly. Not any song I knew, just a tune. Under his breath while shelving books. I started looking forward to Saturdays. Once he asked if I'd ever read The Secret History. I said no. He handed me a copy. "Let me know what you think," he said, tapping the cover lightly. I read the whole thing in 3 days, then reread it. Not because I loved it. Honestly, a bunch of pretentious students solving a murder, but because it came from him, a shared thread. Meanwhile, my old life kept unraveling. Kelsey posted a story about aligning with your truest self while wearing a new robe I'd seen on a luxury site. Drew was nowhere in the background. Just the marble countertop I paid for, and a glass of wine that probably came out of my wine fridge. I dug deeper. The mortgage still unpaid for 2 months. The refinancing Kelsey tried to initiate denied. Because guess whose name was still on the house? Mine. And guess who never signed it over? Also me. One night I opened a new tab and searched real estate attorneys near me. Found a woman named Danielle Nguyen. Sharp eyes. Great reviews. I made an appointment. Danielle didn't flinch when I told her my story. In fact, she said I've seen worse, and you have more leverage than you realize. I handed over the deed papers. She skimmed. You're still the legal owner? She said, tapping the signature line. This house is yours. I asked, can I sell it? She smiled. You can do more than that. So we got to work. But I didn't rush. Because some revenge is best served cold. Here's a quirky bit of knowledge. In the 1800s, women couldn't legally own property after marriage. Everything defaulted to their husbands. We've come a long way, right? And yet there I was, having to remind people I still owned my own damn house. Anyway, while Danielle prepared the documents, I kept showing up at the bookstore. James had started setting aside titles he thought I might like. I saw this and thought of you, he said one afternoon, handing me a worn copy of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I almost cried. Not because of the book, but because someone thought of me without being told to. That week I bought a second-hand laptop, started typing out everything from my handwritten journals, organized them into folders, one labeled James, one labeled Drew or Kelsey, one labeled The House. It felt like building a map, or maybe a case file. And yeah, part of me worried I was going too far, that I was letting this become something twisted. But the thing is, when you've been quiet for too long, speaking up feels radical, dangerous even. Academic circles call it learned invisibility. You get so used to being background noise that when you finally speak, it feels like screaming. I wasn't screaming. I was preparing. And James, he still didn't know. But he knew me, at least a version of me, and that version wasn't just a shadow anymore. He asked if I wanted to join a community book club. I laughed. I don't play well with groups. He shrugged. It's mostly people in fleece and orthopedic shoes. You'd fit right in. It was a joke, but I hadn't felt this seen in years. I said I'd think about it. Here's your old age wisdom for this part. After 50, the brain starts shrinking ever so slightly each year, but social interaction slows it down. I didn't need more proof. James might have been saving more of me than he realized. One night I stopped by near closing. He was mopping. The store was quiet, golden calm. You should work here, he said, half joking. Maybe I replied more serious than I meant to be. He smiled, leaned on the mop. There's something about you. I raised a brow. Should I be flattered or worried? He grinned. Flattered. You remind me of my favorite teacher growing up. Patient, sharp, kind of intimidating, but in a good way. That moment nearly knocked me over, because even without knowing, he saw something in me worth naming. It was subtle, but the universe had shifted. And somewhere across town, a house was about to be listed for sale. They wouldn't see it coming, but I had never been more ready. The envelope was cream-colored and thick, official-looking. I slid it across the table at Danielle's office, my fingers slightly trembling, not from fear, but from restraint. Inside were copies of the deed, the mortgage history, and the signed agreement to proceed with the sale of the house. The house I bought. The house I maintained. The house they had turned into a curated museum of self-importance and delusion. Danielle gave me a nod. Once this is filed, they'll be notified within 7 business days. Good, I said, my voice level, as if I hadn't rehearsed those 2 syllables 100 times. I left her office with a strange lightness in my chest, like something had finally been pried loose. Across town, Kelsey was posting her latest Rise with Kelsey coaching snippet, filmed in my old living room, of course. Something about manifesting abundance by decluttering mental blocks. Ironic, considering the most cluttered thing in that house was their unpaid credit card bills. I had receipts, literal ones. Using public records, social media, timestamps, and some very mild sleuthing, I built a timeline. Kelsey's so-called business had no tax filings for the past 2 quarters. She was staging photo shoots in rented Airbnbs and passing them off as home transformations. Her clients, mostly bots or affiliate links. Her LinkedIn, a joke. Her testimonials, word-for-word copies from other sites. Let's just say if you ever need a crash course in illusion, don't study magicians. Study influencers. Here's a quirky off-topic fact for you. Chameleons don't change color to blend in with their surroundings. They do it to communicate emotions. Basically, they're mood rings with legs. Kelsey was no different, except she hadn't realized the mask was slipping. I wanted the fall to be slow, not because I was vindictive, but because I needed them to understand what erosion feels like, what it's like to watch the foundation under your feet dissolve grain by grain. Back at the bookstore, James had no idea any of this was happening. He was still setting aside books for me, still chatting about weather and local jazz nights, still treating me with quiet respect that felt almost medicinal. I found myself lingering longer. One afternoon I asked him, "What made you want to run a bookstore?" He tilted his head thoughtfully. "I was supposed to be a teacher, but I fell in love with books before I ever loved people. This place lets me share that." "You're good at it," he smiled. "You're not too bad at conversation yourself." That made me laugh. Only took me 6 decades to get the hang of it. It was small talk, sure, but it meant more than most heart-to-hearts I'd ever had with Drew. Speaking of Drew, he finally reached out again. A text this time. "Mom, we got a letter about the house. What's going on? Please call me." I didn't reply, because I'd spent years answering calls from a version of him that only reached out when he needed something, not when he wanted me. Here's a nugget of wisdom from sociology: people respond to incentives, not morals, not logic, incentives. For years, I had incentivized his detachment by rewarding it with unconditional support. No more. The next morning, I mailed a second envelope. This one went to Kelsey's parents. Inside a file, every document I had compiled about her fraudulent business, screenshots, tax records, anonymized client statements. A single post-it stuck on top with a handwritten note. "Everything you think you know is a performance. No signature, no return address, just truth." 2 days later, things started to crack. Kelsey's Instagram went dark. No more daily meditations in my kitchen. Her newest post, some fluffy quote about resilience, was flooded with odd comments and questions she didn't answer. Then the comments disappeared altogether. Her workshop scheduled for next week cancelled due to unforeseen circumstances, and my neighbor Beth, who still followed her out of morbid curiosity, texted me, "Did you hear Kelsey's mum was seen storming out of their house, yelling on the phone? Looked like she'd been crying." I didn't smile. Not exactly. But I did breathe a little deeper that day. Later that afternoon, I stood at the bookstore's checkout counter with a used copy of The Art of Stillness. James looked up from his register and said, "You ever think about writing something?" I blinked. Me. "Yeah, you've got a storyteller's gaze." I wanted to tell him I already had, that I had a notebook full of words I hadn't let anyone see, that my life was a stack of unsent letters, footnotes, scribbled in the margins of other people's stories. But instead I said I'll think about it. As I turned to leave, he called out softly, "Hey, you remind me of someone." I smiled. "Yeah, someone brave, someone real." It hit me harder than I expected, because he didn't know who I was, and still he saw me. Unlike Drew, who had seen me every day for 25 years and still somehow missed every inch of me. Academic language calls this perceived versus actual closeness. It's the gap between how close we feel to someone and how close we actually are. James and I, maybe we weren't close, but we were honest, and that I was learning was worth far more than blood. It was raining the day James invited me in for tea. I'd stopped by late, thinking I'd just peek at the new arrivals shelf and slip out unnoticed. But the downpour outside had picked up so fast, I couldn't bring myself to leave. I stood at the door, watching it sheet down the windows like nature had decided to wash the whole town in one go. "You'll be drenched," he said, voice low and warm behind me. "Come to the back, I've got a kettle going." I hesitated just long enough to remind myself that this was real, that I wasn't imagining the kindness in his voice. The back room was modest, a worn couch, mismatched mugs, a faint smell of peppermint and old paper. It wasn't curated or filtered. It was lived in. And something about that made me feel like I'd finally stepped into a part of the story that was mine. He poured 2 mugs of tea and handed me one. "You always come alone," he said, not accusing, just curious. I sipped the tea. "I'm good at alone. Most people who say that aren't," he replied. I let out a soft laugh. Fair. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't beg to be filled. Just 2 people listening to rain and the occasional creak of the bookstore settling into the night. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked suddenly. I blinked. I used to. And now I believe in choices and consequences. He nodded slowly like he understood more than I meant to say. I wanted to blurt it all out. "You're my son. I know everything. I have your baby photo hidden in a trunk above my radiator." But I didn't, because timing matters, and I wanted this moment to be soft. Instead, I said, "You remind me of someone too." He looked at me curious. "A boy I used to dream about when I was younger," I said. "Smart, kind. The kind of boy who grew up into the kind of man people trusted with their quiet." His face changed, but he didn't speak. Just nodded once, like maybe he knew he was carrying something he hadn't earned but wanted to. Meanwhile, Drew sent another message, this one longer. "I don't know what you're doing or why, but we're in a bad spot. Olivia's parents pulled out of helping us. She's blaming me. Everything is falling apart. Please." "I'm sorry. Can we talk?" Ah, yes, the classic post-collapse apology. I didn't respond. Because apologies that only come when someone's world is burning aren't apologies. They're insurance claims. And here's your quirky fact of the day: elephants can smell water from over 12 miles away. Which is fascinating when you think about how humans can't even recognize emotional dehydration until we're crawling through the desert of our own making. I had been emotionally dehydrated for years, and Drew never offered a sip. But James made tea. It's funny how quickly a person can become important. How you can know someone for decades and still feel like a stranger to them, while a person you've only shared 5 conversations with starts to feel like home. At one point that night, he asked me if I had kids. I froze, then lied. 1 son. Grown now. We don't speak. He nodded with quiet understanding. Family's complicated. That almost made me laugh. Almost. If only he knew. Later, as the rain lightened and I prepared to leave, he walked me to the door, held it open. His eyes lingered on mine a second too long, like he was trying to figure something out. "You have a calm about you," he said. "But it feels hard-earned." I smiled. "That's the only kind worth having." When I got back to my apartment, I sat on the couch and stared at the worn envelope with Ruth's handwriting. I pulled out the baby photo again. His name written in the corner, James Bennett. I held the photo up next to the one I'd secretly taken of him on my phone that afternoon. Him laughing with a customer, arms crossed over his chest, eyes crinkled just slightly. Same mouth, same left dimple. That night, I wrote a single sentence in my journal. He deserves to know. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Still, I knew the cost of dropping truth like a bomb. And I had to decide, would I be the woman who turned his life upside down, or the one who helped him land gently when it did? There's a term in philosophy called moral luck. It means you can do the right thing at the wrong time and still cause damage. I wasn't going to rush this, because I didn't want to be the reason James stopped trusting kindness. And if there was one thing I had learned by now, it's that when people finally feel seen, it can either heal them or break them completely. I was hoping for the first, but I was preparing for the second. I woke early the next morning to the click of my radiator and the faint hum of a garbage truck somewhere outside. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, like the kind that makes you question whether the world still exists beyond your windows. The documents sat on my kitchen table like a loaded gun. The listing agreement, the motion to sell the house, the valuation report from Danielle's office. I had signed everything. It was real now. The house, the one where I spent my best years trying to matter, was officially going on the market. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sipped it while staring at the notification on my phone real estate agent has submitted to MLS. Listing goes live at noon. At exactly 1200 p.m., I watched the online listing populate photos of my old living room, now covered in cheap throw blankets and curated nonsense. Of the kitchen I tiled with my own hands, now filtered into pastel lies. The asking price was strong. The market was in my favor. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. I took a long breath and exhaled into the quiet. Then my phone buzzed. Drew, what the hell is going on? The house is listed. You didn't even tell me Olivia is losing it. I stared at the message like it was a museum exhibit, Exhibit A.A. Son, who finally looked up when the ceiling collapsed. I didn't respond, because there was nothing left to explain. Here's a quirky legal tidbit for you in most states. If your name is on the deed, it doesn't matter who lives in the house. You own it. Plain and simple. And I was finally ready to cash in on that forgotten truth. That evening, I passed by the house one last time, not to go inside, just to see it. Kelsey was on the porch, talking into her phone with a cigarette in one hand and a glass of something pink in the other. She didn't see me. Drew was inside, pacing the living room. I didn't feel smug. I felt finished. You know that odd old age wisdom about how your hearing fades, but only at certain frequencies. I think the same is true for emotional noise. At some point, you stop hearing the drama. You just stop tuning in. Back at my apartment, I pulled out the envelope again, the one I had set aside for James. I'd been practicing what I'd say for weeks now, drafting sentences on napkins in the margins of magazines, on grocery receipts. I'm not here to take anything from you. You were never lost, you just weren't with me. Can I tell you a story about a hospital and a woman who never stopped looking, but none of them felt right? That night, I sat down and wrote him a letter. Not to give him. Not yet. Just to hear my voice say the truth aloud, even if only on paper. Dear James, if you're reading this, it means I finally got the courage to do the scariest thing I've ever done. Not because I think you'll hate me, but because I know what it means to have your story rewritten. I didn't know. Not for decades. I only found out recently from someone who cared enough to keep the truth safe until I was ready. You were supposed to come home with me, but you didn't. And I raised someone else instead. I loved him. I did. But I never understood why it always felt slightly off, like I was singing a song in the wrong key. And then I met you, and you felt like music I already knew. I'm not asking for anything. Not a relationship. Not forgiveness. Not even understanding. I just want you to know someone out there loved you long before she ever knew your name. And that someone is me. I didn't sign it. I folded it and placed it in a new envelope. A keepsake, maybe. Or a promise. The next day, James and I had coffee again, sat outside the bookstore on a bench that wobbled slightly on one side. We watched people stroll by, couples, kids, dogs, a woman in neon leggings on a scooter. James sipped his tea and said, "You seem lighter lately." I raised an eyebrow. "Have you been studying me?" He chuckled. "You're one of my regulars. I pay attention." "You're not so bad yourself," I said. He glanced at me. "You ever think about what your life would have looked like if just one thing had gone differently all the time?" But I just nodded. I think everyone does. "You strike me as someone who had a lot of dreams," once he said. "I did," I replied. "I just lent them to other people for a while." He smiled quietly. "Maybe it's time to ask for them back." Academic philosophers talk about counterfactual thinking, the what-ifs that haunt our sense of identity. But sometimes what-if doesn't lead to grief. Sometimes it leads to possibility. That day, he handed me a flyer. We're starting author readings here next month. I'm looking for someone to open the first night. Doesn't have to be published. Just honest. I stared at him. He added, think about it. You have a voice that deserves a room. And for the first time in years, I didn't shrink from the idea of being seen. I took the flyer home and pinned it to my fridge, right next to the photo of James as a newborn, smiling into the blur of time, waiting unknowingly for the truth to come find him. 3 days later, I stood across from my old house again, but this time, I wasn't alone. A real estate agent stood next to me in a tailored blazer, pointing out the newer shingles and the double-pane windows. She kept using words like investment potential and market advantage, and all I could think about was how much my knees hurt from crouching under that same porch years ago to weed the garden Kelsey never touched. Inside, Drew and Kelsey were packing. I hadn't spoken to them. Didn't need to. The legal notice had done all the talking. They had 30 days to vacate. No extensions. No exceptions. My lawyer had been crystal clear. You owe them nothing. You gave them decades. That's more than most people get for free. And here's your academic debate phrase for the day implied consent does not equal permanent surrender. Just because I'd been silent all those years didn't mean I agreed to be invisible forever. I watched Kelsey carry a box labeled Wellness Candles to the car. She wore sunglasses too big for her face and a hoodie that read, Alignment above all. I had to bite my cheek to keep from snorting. Meanwhile, Drew was on the phone again. His posture slumped, his voice sharp. I could tell the illusion had finally cracked. Not just the financial fantasy, but the emotional scaffolding too. For so long, he stood by her, letting her chip away at me. And now he was paying for every silent nod. They hadn't spoken to me directly since the listing went live. The last thing I'd heard was another voicemail from Kelsey. Margaret, this is insane. This is our home. You're ruining everything for everyone. I had replayed it once, then deleted it, because what she called ruining, I called returning. Returning the space to the person who actually built it. Here's a quirky fact. Flamingos aren't pink when they're born. They're gray. They turn pink because of the shrimp they eat. In other words, their color, what we associate with them, is a result of what they absorb. And for years I absorbed bitterness, silence, shame, but not anymore. Meanwhile, at the bookstore, James had added a new section, staff picks. There was a little handwritten card with my name on it. Margaret's choice, followed by a short note. This one will stay with you long after the last page. I hadn't seen it until someone else pointed it out. When I read the card, I had to leave for fresh air. It wasn't just the book. It was the fact that someone had chosen to give me space. A literal nameplate. I didn't cry. Okay, I cried a little. Because the last time someone put my name on something, it was a utility bill. Later that week, I walked by the farmer's market and saw James shopping with a canvas tote slung over his shoulder. We bumped into each other near a honey vendor. He smiled. Didn't expect to see you in the wild, he said, teasing. I laughed. You caught me trying to decide between lavender honey and not paying $5 for a jar of sugar. He handed me one from his own bag. Take mine. I have two. I hesitated. I insist, he said. It's the least I can do after stealing all your good recommendations. We walked a bit after that. Talked about nothing, tomatoes, dogs, bad weather. But it felt like something. At one point he asked, What did your son do for work? It hit like a dart to the chest. He worked in marketing, I said. Sort of floated. Never quite stuck. James nodded. Tough industry. I said nothing. Because how do you say he didn't have to stick? I was the glue. And then they acted like I was the mess. The night before the closing paperwork was due, Drew showed up at my apartment. I saw him through the peephole wrinkled shirt, eyes puffy. He knocked. Twice. Then softly, Mom, please. I just want to talk. I didn't open the door. I just leaned my forehead against the wood and let the silence do the work. He waited 10 minutes, then left. No banging, no yelling. Just left. I made tea afterward. The good kind. The kind I didn't buy when I lived in that house. because I was too busy saving money for other people's nonsense. And I wrote in my journal, they finally felt the silence, and I didn't feel guilty for it. Here's a final note for this part. Guilt is a tool, a leash. And when you drop it, you learn to walk again without dragging someone else's expectations behind you. The next day, I got a message from the escrow officer. All funds have cleared. You're now officially the sole recipient of the sale. I stood in my kitchen, holding my phone, the peppermint tea steeping behind me, and whispered the words I had been too afraid to say out loud. It's mine now. My peace. My freedom. My story. And somewhere across town, James was shelving books he didn't know were part of our story too. Not yet, but soon. I used to believe that silence was the enemy, that if someone wasn't talking to you, they were waging a private war against your worth. But lately I was learning something new. Silence could be a boundary, a fortress, a clean, quiet line in the sand that said no more. Drew's last message had come the night before. I hope someday you understand how much this hurt me. I read it while stirring honey into my tea, James's honey. I didn't respond, because I already understood how much I had been hurt. I had spent years being the doormat to someone else's sense of entitlement. And it turns out, when you finally get up off the floor, the people who liked wiping their feet on you don't take it well. That afternoon, I went to the bookstore. James was behind the counter sleeves, rolled to the elbows, a pencil tucked behind one ear, like something out of an indie film. He was helping a teenager find a book for their AP Lit class, offering genuine suggestions, not just pushing the expensive editions. When the kid left, I handed James a manila envelope. He raised an eyebrow. What's this? Just something I thought you might want to see. He looked puzzled, but didn't open it right away. We chatted like always, weather foot traffic, the way people were forgetting how to use crosswalks properly. It felt normal, comfortable. As I turned to leave, I hesitated at the door. If you have questions, I'll be around. That night, I waited. I didn't check my phone obsessively. I didn't pace. I just existed. The next morning, a message came. From James. Can we meet? We sat in the bookstore break room. The envelope, now open, sat between us. His hands rested on either side of it like it might leap off the table. I read it twice, he said quietly. I figured you would. He didn't look at me right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the photo, his baby photo, and the hospital documents Ruth had saved like sacred proof. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, I replied. But I owed you the truth. He nodded slowly. All this time. I didn't know. Not until recently. And the woman who raised me, she loved you. I can't imagine she didn't. He leaned back in the chair, hands in his lap, eyes distant. I love her. She's my mom. I wouldn't want to take that from either of you. He looked at me then. Really looked. But I'm the mother who never got to be your mother. He didn't cry. But his voice cracked when he asked, why did you come here all those times before telling me? Because I needed to see who you were before I asked to be part of your life. He nodded, processing. I offered a half smile. You're a good man. I had help. I bit my lip. I wish some of that help had come from me. James reached for the envelope again, his fingers tracing the corner. This explains some things. Like what? I never felt disconnected exactly, but I always sensed something unspoken in my family. Little pauses, missed glances. Now it makes sense. I'm sorry, I whispered, for everything. He didn't answer right away. Just took a long breath, held it, and exhaled slowly. I'm not mad. I'm just overwhelmed. There's no right way to feel. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. Can I ask you something strange? Sure. Do you remember anything from the hospital? I shook my head. Only the usual. The exhaustion. The nurse who held my hand when the epidural didn't take. Nothing unusual. That's what kills me. If there had been a sign. But there wasn't. He looked down at the letter again. What happens now? I don't know. I'm not here to demand a relationship or rewrite your life. I just wanted to give you the option of knowing. He smiled, small and tired. I guess the universe thinks I needed a plot twist. We sat in silence after that. And then softly he asked, "You want to stay for tea?" Tears welled in my eyes. I'd love to. We didn't talk about the files again that day. Just books, childhood snacks, how he hated the smell of gasoline but loved the sound of distant lawnmowers. At one point, I told him I had started writing again. He looked surprised. What kind of writing? Memoir, maybe. Stories. Bits of memory stitched together with thread I'm just now finding. "You should keep going," he said. "You've got something people need to hear." It was the kindest endorsement I'd ever received. And it wasn't from the son I raised. It was from the one who had been missing from my life all along, and still managed to make space for me anyway. There's an idea in narrative therapy called reauthoring, the process of rewriting your personal story to give yourself new meaning. That afternoon, sitting across from James with peppermint tea and worn paperbacks, I realized I was finally doing it. And I wasn't doing it alone. The morning I boxed up the last of the old family photos, it felt less like packing and more like editing. I stood in the middle of my apartment, surrounded by images of birthday cakes, messy haircuts, class photos, where Drew never smiled. I didn't throw them away, I couldn't, but I also couldn't keep them on the walls anymore, not because they made me angry, but because they belonged to a story that was finished. The woman in those pictures, she was always in the background, holding the cake, taping the streamers, never in the center, never framed. And I realized something I had built an entire life without being the main character in any of it. Not anymore. I placed the photos into a storage box and labeled it simply "Before." The house closed 2 days later. The final wire transfer hit my account just before noon. I stared at the number on the screen for a long time, not in shock, just in quiet disbelief. For years, I had been living paycheck to paycheck, cutting coupons, skipping dinners out so that Drew and Olivia could have everything. And now the balance stared back at me like a second chance. I didn't spend it. I donated part of it, quietly, anonymously. A foundation that helps women rebuild their lives after being financially and emotionally discarded. Women like me. They called to thank me. I let it go to voicemail. Meanwhile, Drew had moved out. I knew from the real estate agent that he was living in a one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. Olivia was gone. Apparently, her parents cut her off after receiving my anonymous packet. Her brand collapsed like a flan in a microwave. No more fake clients, no more retreats in my living room. Just filtered silence. Drew tried to call again. This time I answered. I don't know why. Maybe because it was time to see what was left. "Mom," he said, his voice rough, "can we meet?" Just once I replied. Somewhere public. We chose a park. Neutral territory. The kind of place with tired benches and kids screaming at geese. I wore sunglasses and brought my own coffee. I told myself I was doing this for closure, not reconciliation. He was already there when I arrived, sitting forward, elbows on knees, like a child in detention. "You look good," he said. I didn't respond. He rubbed his hands together. I deserved it. All of it. I raised an eyebrow. "Not here for confessions, Drew. He sighed. "I let her turn me into something I wasn't. You let her turn me into something I never was." He flinched. "You were right. About everything." "That's new. I don't expect you to forgive me." "I don't need to forgive you," I said. "I need to let go of you." He looked up sharply. "I'm not cutting you out," I added, "but I'm no longer carrying you. You're not my burden to bear anymore." He nodded slowly, like the words were hitting him one at a time. I was a coward. "No," I said. "You were comfortable, and I made that possible. I don't want to be that anymore." "Then don't be." There's an expression in grief therapy: closure isn't about doors. It's about walls with windows. Sometimes you don't close the past. You just learn how to look at it differently. He looked at me with wet eyes. "Are you seeing someone?" The question caught me off guard. "Why?" He shrugged. "You seem lighter." I thought of James. of tea and poetry and quiet conversations about weather patterns. No, I said. I'm just learning how to breathe again. He nodded, and for the first time in years, I saw the boy I used to know. But I didn't reach for him, because I didn't need to. As I got up to leave, he stood too. If there's ever a place for me in your life, I turned to him and gently said, I'll think about it. It was the most honest thing I could offer, and it was enough. That night, I met James for coffee. The bookstore was closed, but he had the keys and a kettle. I was thinking, he said, pouring the water, maybe we could host a reading series. You know, real voices, real stories. I smiled. You already know my vote. He nodded, then added, I keep thinking about your letter. I don't know what to do with all of it yet. You don't have to know, but I don't want to waste it. He looked at me, then really looked. You gave me something I didn't know I was missing. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, I whispered. And in that bookstore, surrounded by the quiet smell of pages and time, I felt something settle in me. Not a finish line, not a triumph, but peace. Real, grown-up, boring, beautiful peace. The first time James called me just to talk, it was about oranges. Specifically, how he couldn't figure out which kind was best for marmalade Seville or blood orange. I was in the middle of reorganizing my closet when the call came in, and when I answered, I could hear the hesitation in his voice. He didn't lead with, "Hi, it's your son," or "We need to talk." Just, "Do you like marmalade?" I laughed more from surprise than the question itself. "Seville," I answered. "Always Seville. Blood orange makes it too bitter." There was a pause. "I thought so," he said. "I just wasn't sure." And just like that, we fell into a 20-minute conversation about breakfast rituals, childhood toast preferences, and why store-bought jams never feel like enough. It wasn't about the marmalade, of course. It never is. It was about testing the thread, seeing if it would hold without snapping. It did. Over the following weeks, James and I began stitching something real together. Still no labels. Still no pressure. He didn't call me Mom. I didn't ask him to. But he did ask questions about my favorite books, about what I loved as a child, about what it felt like to walk away from everything I knew. Once he asked, "Do you regret raising Drew?" I thought about it carefully. "No," I said, because love, real love, doesn't have to be returned to be real. It just deserves not to be abused. He nodded like he understood, then added, "I think I would have liked being raised by you." That one hurt and healed at the same time. Back in the legal world, Danielle wrapped up the last documents, finalizing my donation, ensuring every cent was handled. She asked if I wanted a press release, a public thank you. I declined, because this story wasn't about applause. It was about truth. And truth doesn't need to trend. Here's your quirky fact of the day. The heart has its own electrical system. It can beat even outside the body for a short time. I think people are like that too. When we leave the places that hurt us, we don't just stop. We keep beating. We survive outside what was supposed to be home. Speaking of homes, James gave me a key, not to his apartment, not to his past, to something better, the new room at the back of the bookstore. He had added furniture, an armchair, a small round table, a reading lamp. The sign above the doorway read, "The next chapter." "It's yours," he said simply, "for as long as you want it." I stood there stunned. He handed me the key. To write, to breathe, to be. And I did. I came in early some mornings, made tea, and wrote. I brought in a potted plant, a blanket, a photo not of Drew but of myself as a girl. Bright-eyed, hopeful. James didn't hover. He'd peek in, sometimes drop off a scone, or ask how the writing was going. One morning, I left a draft on the table, half of a memoir, chapter, half a letter to no one in particular. He read it, and left a note. "More of this, please. People need to know how strong quiet can be." Meanwhile, Drew's life was moving on without much movement. He sent one last message. "I understand now, I think. I hope someday we find a way back." I didn't answer, but I didn't delete it either. That's what forgiveness looks like, sometimes a message left unread, but not discarded. The bookstore room became more than a workspace. It became a mirror, a place where I wasn't erased, reduced, or backgrounded. It was the first time I'd been given space simply because I existed. One rainy Thursday, James sat across from me in that room, holding a copy of The Little Prince. My mom used to read this to me when I had nightmares, he said. She sounds like a good mother, I replied. She was, he said softly. And somehow, so are you. I looked up. He didn't take it back, didn't qualify it. And I didn't need him to. In that moment, something shifted. We didn't need DNA to be real. We were choosing each other. Not as substitutes, not as replacements. As people, imperfect, evolving human people who were willing to show up. And isn't that all we really want? To be chosen even after the truth is out. That night, I locked the bookstore behind me and walked home in the drizzle. The streets shimmered under the wet streetlights. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was aware of everything I'd lost and everything I was finally beginning to find. The bookstore became my favorite place in the world, not because it had a coffee machine that groaned like a tired ox or a couch that dipped in the middle, but because I never had to apologize for being there. No one asked what I was doing. No one asked if I was still writing. No one asked if I was over it yet. They just let me be. That little back room, the next chapter, was mine. James made sure of it. He'd tell people I was working on something important, even when I was just staring out the window, thinking about whether or not I preferred winter pears or bosque. He gave me space to matter. Drew never did that. Not once. Some nights, I sat in that room long after the store had closed, wrapped in the blanket I brought from home, typing by the soft glow of the desk lamp. The heater rattled like it was retelling its own story. Outside, the town quieted into a hush that made me feel like I was the only person still awake. And maybe that was true. Here's a little old age wisdom for you. As we grow older, our brains start pruning unused neural connections, streamlining. It's nature's way of saying, let's stop wasting time remembering that ex's phone number from 1982. I think our hearts do something similar. They stop remembering the people who didn't fight to stay. That's how I finally started forgetting Drew. Not with bitterness, but with stillness. Olivia had left town, packed up, and gone after her brand tanked. The few friends she had on social media turned on her the minute her story unraveled. That's the thing about pretending to be perfect. It only takes one crack. Drew stayed behind, moved into a small apartment above a liquor store. I know this because I walked past it once on the way to the library. He didn't see me. He was carrying groceries, milk eggs, and a six-pack. He looked fine. Not happy, not miserable, just ordinary. And that made me feel better than I expected, because it proved he could survive without me. Meanwhile, James and I were building something that didn't need defining. He started inviting me to events, author nights, readings, even once a trivia night at the cafe next door. I never said no. Not because I needed to go, but because I wanted to. Once, during a lull between events, I helped him restock the memoir section. I handed him a copy of The Glass Castle, and he said, "You know you'd write circles around this if you wanted." I rolled my eyes. It's easier to admire someone else's story than confront your own. He looked at me, then serious. "But yours isn't over yet." I blinked. "You think?" "I know. And people need to hear it." Later that evening, I found a note on my writing desk in the back room. Start with what hurt the most. That's where the healing begins. I cried over that one. Because he was right. So I did. That night, I opened a blank document on the bookstore's old laptop and typed the words, "I was a woman who gave until I vanished." And just like that, I started writing again. Not just notes. Not just letters. A book. A real one. Half memoir, half reclamation. I didn't have a title. I didn't need one yet. All I needed was truth. Here's your quirky off-topic fact for the day. Wombats, those adorable, chunky Australian marsupials, poop in cubes. Perfect little cubes. No one knows why, exactly. but it's proof that even nature finds a way to shape mess into something interesting. So that's what I was doing, shaping the mess. Not erasing it, not burning it down, just making it make sense. James kept showing up too, not just with tea or book suggestions, but in the small ways that matter. Fixing the flickering bulb, replacing the rug without being asked, asking how I was without trying to fix me. One day he brought in a framed photo. It was of him as a child, holding a toy airplane grinning into the sun. He placed it on the shelf beside mine, the photo of me, as a girl in braided pigtails and a crooked smile. I figured she could keep him company, he said. I had to walk away so he wouldn't see me cry. Sometimes grief doesn't howl. Sometimes it just sits beside you, quietly watching, as you learn to live without the thing you thought you'd never survive losing. Sometimes healing looks like putting two photos side by side, and sometimes that's enough. The reading room smelled like cinnamon and cedarwood the night I finally shared my story aloud. James had asked if I'd be the first reader in the next chapter series. At first I said no twice. Then I said, I'll think about it for a solid 3 weeks. But deep down, I knew I'd say yes. I think James knew it too. There were maybe 12 chairs set up that evening, mismatched and creaky, but every one of them was full. Locals, a few customers I'd seen browsing a high school teacher with a scarf that looked like it had been knit out of poetry. James introduced me with nothing more than, "She has something important to say, and I think we'd all do well to listen." I stood in the front, my pages slightly trembling in my hands, not from fear, but from knowing I couldn't unread what I was about to say. I read from the first chapter. I was a woman who gave until I vanished. Then I became the woman who took it all back, not with rage, not with fire, but with silenced truth and the kind of strength they never saw coming. And as I read on about the hospital switch, about Drew, about James, I didn't look up much. But when I did, I saw James, sitting still, hands folded, eyes soft, listening, not because he had to, but because he chose to. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then came a soft round of applause. Not explosive, not performative, just honest. Afterward, someone approached me and said, "That was one of the most powerful things I've heard." It reminded me of my own mother. I smiled, thanked her, but what I didn't say was I finally reminded myself of me too. James lingered until everyone had left. "You were incredible," he said. "I didn't cry," I replied. "Not on the outside." We sat in the room afterward, no more audience, just us, and the smell of tea cooling on the desk. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what it all means." I nodded. Me too. I still love my parents. That hasn't changed. I never hoped it would. But I love this too, he added quietly. "Whatever this is, it doesn't need a label," I said. "It just needs care." He looked at me then, and for the first time the air between us felt clear. No secrets, no weight, just presence. Here's a little academic term that finally made sense to me. Integrative identity. It means we can be many things at once. Not just what we were born into, not just what happened to us, but also what we choose. I wasn't just someone's mother. I was a woman who wrote her way back to herself. A few days later, we redecorated the reading room together. James brought in a new rug. I brought in a framed quote from one of my favorite books. "And still like air I rise." Maya Angelou. James read it aloud, nodded once, then hung it right above the bookshelf near the window. He started calling the room Mom's office to tease me. I never corrected him. Drew didn't reach out again, and I didn't expect him to. But one day, I passed by a bulletin board near the market and saw a flyer looking for part-time work. Call Drew. Handy, reliable, and learning every day. I didn't tear it down. I didn't take a photo. I just looked at it and kept walking. He was finding his way, and so was I. One night after closing, James said, "You know, I think you're the bravest person I know." I laughed. "You need to meet more people." "I mean it," he said. "You started over. Most people don't even realize they can." And then he asked very gently, "Do you think of me as your son?" The question landed softly, but it landed. I took a deep breath. I think of you as mine, but not because of biology, because of choice. He nodded like that was enough, because it was. Here's your quirky fact. For this part, sea otters hold hands when they sleep, so they don't drift apart. No one told them to do it. They just learned how to stay connected even when the tide pulls. James and I, we were figuring that out too. No declarations, no definitions, just two people learning how to hold on gently. It was early spring when the last layer of frost melted off the bookstore windows, and everything in town seemed to blink awake again. The trees grew little green fists of leaves, the air lost its sharp edge, and the sound of bicycles returned like a hopeful chorus. James showed up one morning with a fresh scone, still warm, wrapped in a napkin. For the boss, he said, placing it on my writing desk in the next chapter. You're going to make me lazy, I replied, but I was already taking a bite. You've earned lazy, he said, and then he left me to write. The memoir was nearly done now, 85,000 words, each one carved from silence pain, and the kind of clarity that can only come after everything falls apart. Some chapters still needed polishing. Others I wasn't ready to reread. But the bones were there. And so was I. I thought about submitting it one day. Maybe not now. Maybe never. It didn't need to be a bestseller. It didn't need to be sold in airports. It just needed to exist. Because I had spent a lifetime disappearing into other people's needs, and this time the story was mine. James had read most of it. One evening, he looked up from chapter 12 and said, You don't write like someone who's trying to forgive. I'm not, I told him. I'm writing like someone who finally remembered her own name. There's an old age truth I came across while researching chapter headings. People don't get wiser because they grow older. They get wiser because they finally stop pretending. That was me. Done pretending. I walked past the old house once more. A young couple lived there now. There was a swing on the porch and a kid's drawing taped to the front window. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, hand tucked in my pocket, then moved on. No ghost left in my chest. No fire in my throat. Just distance. Emotional, spiritual, and finally geographical. Meanwhile, James invited me to meet his parents. He said it slowly, cautiously, like he was testing a bridge before stepping onto it. I don't know what I'll tell them, but I want you to meet them. You're important to me. I nodded. I'd like that. The invitation wasn't about truth bombs or dramatic revelations. It was about presence, being seen, being welcomed. The visit was simple. Dinner, conversation. A few polite questions about books and writing. His mother wore a cardigan with a loose thread on the sleeve. His father told a joke about misplacing his reading glasses. They were kind. I didn't want to take anything from them, and they didn't make me feel like I was trying to. Later, when James walked me to my car, he said, I think they liked you. I think I liked them too. We stood in the driveway for a minute. Then he asked, Are you happy? I thought about it. Not the performative kind of happiness. Not the I'm fine mask or the everything happens for a reason speech. Real, honest-to-God contentment. I think I'm becoming happy, I said. And that's even better. Here's one last quirky fact. Jellyfish don't have hearts. No blood, no brain. Just a system that flows. Maybe that's why they're so graceful. They've let go of the things we cling to. I'm not saying I want to be a jellyfish, but I do like the idea of moving through the world without carrying old stories like anchors. Back at the bookstore, we installed a little plaque outside the next chapter room. Just one line, dedicated to the woman who rewrote everything. No name, no photo, but it was mine, and that was enough. I spent that night at home, wrapped in my favorite blanket, sipping tea that didn't need a reason. I opened my laptop, typed the final paragraph of my book. Then I walked to the window and let the breeze blow through the curtains. Outside, the town was quiet. The world hadn't changed. But I had, and sometimes that's the only miracle we really get. Tonight, we followed the journey of a woman who gave everything her time, her love, her money, and herself, only to be reduced to background noise in her own home. But instead of staying in the shadows, She did something many never find the courage to do. She left. Quietly, decisively. She didn't scream. She didn't burn bridges. She simply walked away with the keys to the house still warm in her palm, and the last word lodged silently in her chest. What followed was not a collapse, but a becoming. In an old apartment that smelled like time and silence, she discovered a truth that reframed her entire life. The son she had raised was not biologically hers, and the one who was had been living nearby all along. And yet this story was never just about biology. It was about dignity, about seeing clearly the people who made you feel invisible and deciding finally that you deserved to be seen. Through late-night tea, awkward bookstore visits, and one brave conversation at a creaky table, she began to piece together a new life. A real one. She didn't punish her past, she just stopped living in it. And by the time she held the key to the next chapter, she was no longer someone else's ghost. She was her own beginning. So wherever you are tonight, whether you're nursing a quiet hurt or standing on the edge of your own reinvention, I hope you remember this. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk out the door you once held open for everyone else. And sometimes the most radical kind of love is the kind you finally give to yourself. Now take a deep breath. Let it all settle. Let yourself sleep knowing you are allowed to start over, even now, especially now.